centuries Europe's main port of emigration to America. Over 7 million people set sail from these shores to begin a new life in a new world. Who could have imagined from this same northern landscape would come 4 musical revolutionaries whose work would reach every part of the globe and touch the lives of millions? They were known as the Beatles.
Pioneers in almost everything they did.
We're only ever going to be cartoons forever.
They were the mates you wanted to have. You wanted to have that kind of friendship with the people around you.
Yeah, we'll have to change it, I'm sure. We can't stop us in it.
The variety of the music, the scope of the songwriting, and the lyrical imagery, nobody could match them.
They established British beat music worldwide, single-handed.
It doesn't matter about people not liking our records or not liking the way we look, or what we say.
In 1961, people were beginning to realise something's happening here, and it could go a lot further.
This is the street where John Winston Lennon spent the first 6 years of his life. Born in October 1940, his mother Julia gave John his interest in music. She taught him chords on her banjo. She left John to be brought up at his Aunt Mimi's home a few miles away. She was a strict, if loving, disciplinarian. When John wished to play his guitar, he was relegated to the front porch. Each day he cycled to Quarrybank High School, where he was regarded as troublesome. He failed every exam, but showed promise as an artist. In March 1957, he started his first music group, the Quarrymen. He scraped into Liverpool College of Art, and in the bohemian atmosphere of the late 1950s, spent much of his time in the local pubs with a promising young writer, Bill Harry.
I got on very, very well with John. He was a strong personality, it's a sort of quite a weird sense of humour. He did definitely have a charisma, but it was also his talent which I saw. And his Aunt Mimi said she always remembered me because I was the first person ever to call John a genius. John had the ability as a writer, as an artist, and as a musician.
John's group were playing at a church outdoor fete held here in the summer of 1957. Later in the day, they moved to the church hall, where John was introduced to a 15-year-old boy who impressed the Quarrymen with his knowledge of rock and roll lyrics and his ability to tune a guitar. His name was Paul McCartney. Shortly afterwards, he was invited to join John's group. Adjoining John's College of Art was the Liverpool Institute, where Paul McCartney was a pupil. So was George Harrison. The two travelled on the same bus to school. George, named after King George VI, was born in this modest house in February 1943. As a promising young guitarist, he had played in several bands around Liverpool before joining John's Quarrymen. But it was at Paul's home at 24th Inn Road where the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership blossomed. The two teenagers spent hours around the piano, filling exercise books full of lyrics of their first joint compositions, which included I Saw Her Standing There and Love Me Do. The Quarrymen performed around Liverpool as the Silver Beats and the Silver Beatles. When Pete Best became their permanent drummer in August 1960, they settled on the name the Beatles.
No one at the time, I think, was really aware of the huge potential they had because their talent as a group didn't really show in till after they'd been to Hamburg. It was when they went to Hamburg and they had what I call their baptism of fire, because they played in this environment so many hours, up to 8 hours or more a night, night after night, and they really had to forge themselves into a really dynamic performing group. That really changed and that really made something very, very different.
Back in Liverpool, where they returned after 2 months, they were still an unknown group. Just one of many rough and ready rock and roll bands competing on the nightly beat scene.
They were booked at Litherland Town Hall. No one had ever heard of them, and from that particular moment onwards, they really took Liverpool by storm.
If I told you once, I told you a million times.
They debuted at Ray McFall's Cavern Club at a lunchtime session on February the 21st, 1961, a month prior to their first nighttime appearance.
Now, the only booking available for the Beatles was on the Blue Jeans guest night.
These guys turned up in black leather, which was totally unheard of in Liverpool in them days. And of course it was the Beatles, you know, and I mean, I thought they were German. They went on stage after we finished our spot, and you know, Bob Wooler introduced them, and off they went. And we were standing at the back, and we listened to two numbers, and I'd never had such a row in my life. I thought it was absolutely awful.
I told you once, you know, I won't tell you no.
The pub looked the better place to be in at the time, so the pub won, and we went for a pint. When the Beatles went down to a four-piece, then I totally changed my mind about them. You know, I thought they were absolutely brilliant then, you know. McCartney went on bass, and the whole band altered, and it was an absolutely fantastic experience.
Their numbers were different, their musical arrangements were different. They were so dynamic and so well organised. I was amazed at the sound that I was hearing.
And eventually the Beatles were given a Wednesday night, you know, where we were every Tuesday, they were every Wednesday. And I remember coming round the corner into Matthew Street, which was a very narrow street going amongst these warehouses, where the cavern was down in the cellar of one of them, and seeing this amazing queue up the road. And, you know, this is a Tuesday night, and I've got my guitar in my hand, you know, I've just got off the bus from Huyton, and I'm walking down, and I see this queue, and my chest comes out, and I think, oh, wow, look at this, you know. I get into the cavern, and there's about, you know, 80 people in the cavern, and the queue's still outside. I said to the doorman, this big guy, Paddy, who was the doorman, I said, why don't you let them in, Paddy? He said, they are in. I said, no, all that queue outside. He said, oh, that's for tomorrow night for the Beatles. And they were actually queuing the day before, and they slept in Matthew Street, which was not the nicest place to sleep in, you know, in the best of times. They all had the sleeping bags and everything. And I just couldn't believe that people would do that for a local band.
Bill Harry's Merseybeat magazine gave the Liverpool sound its name. A major feature in an early issue described the Beatles as a phenomenon and helped promote their careers. It was written by the cavern's resident DJ, who compared 292 Beatles performances. Bob Wooler.
One of the expressions I used when I wrote this article, which appeared in Merseybeat in August '61, was rugged yet romantic, appealing to both sexes. Now, this was the remarkable thing about the Beatles. They appealed to the lads as much as the girls. I was their unofficial manager throughout 1961, until Brian Epstein came on the scene at the end of '61. They were jaunty, but not flaunty. They were likable. When they were on stage, they were extremely likable. They were infectious. Their humor was infectious. Their manner was infectious. Their music was very powerful. And the look of them was perfect.
They were always sort of individuals from the start. You know, I mean, Lennon was he was a very aggressive person, quite violent, really, if he had to be. McCartney was the PR man of the band. You know, he was nice to everybody in the world. George, we used to call George Dozy George, you know, because he was just, you know, so easygoing, and everything was, yeah, like man.
It was Brian Epstein who was to transform the Beatles' image and steer them to success. He became their manager at the end of 1961.
People looked up to Brian Epstein because not only was he smart and well-mannered and polite and well-educated, you know, his family had money, and that meant a lot in a city where most people didn't have two halfpennies to rattle together, you know.
The Epstein family lived in one of the best parts of Liverpool and had a chain of furniture and record stores. The Whitechapel branch of NEMS, North End Music Stores, was just around the corner from the cavern.
He felt he'd been a failure in a lot of things in his life. Now, the family had put him for a time as manager of one of their stores, and he wanted to prove himself. When he came across at Merseybeat and all what was happening in the Liverpool scene, he thought at last here was a chance to maybe involve himself.
So I went with them to this meeting in the record store on that Wednesday afternoon, half-day closing. I remember it quite well. He was lurking in a darkened store. He unlocked the door and we trooped in. And he must have been wondering, who the hell is this with them? Meaning me, you see. Because I was much older than them. And all the niceties of introductions were not observed. So he was still wondering, I should have taken initiative. And John was aware of this, and he said, oh, this is me dad. We brought me dad along. So I suppose I was supposed to laugh at that, but I rather resented it, because I wasn't that old, you see.
The Beatles originally were a very, very rough sort of group, and they were wearing black leather, swearing on stage, very rough and tough. But Brian made them smart and put all the smart suits on. He used to send them all impeccably typed memos. Do not smoke on stage. Do not talk to the fans, and all this, you know, all instructions on what to do, which John wasn't too happy with.
However, within a month of becoming their manager, Brian secured a studio audition for them at Decca Records in London. He did this with a rough recording of the Beatles made at the Cavern, and with the help of Tony Barrow, later the Beatles' PR man.
Actually, it was awful. It wasn't my place to kind of hire or fire talent at Decca. I purely wrote the sleeve notes there. But I certainly sort of didn't hold out any hope for him and his band. There was then this disastrous New Year's Day audition that they did in London. Brian Epstein had played the whole thing very conservatively, if you like, and told them that they must sing this, they must sing that, and they must definitely not do any of the sort of rip-roaring rave rockers that they did in the Cavern. With the infinite benefit of hindsight, having heard those tapes long afterwards, I can fully see why Decca didn't want the Beatles. The myth that lingered on afterwards, of course, was that all the record companies, all the major record companies turned the Beatles down. Yes, they did, and no, they didn't. What they actually turned down was that one same disastrous Decca audition tape, because that's what Brian Epstein hawked round from company to company.
In fact, he was at wit's end, and I think it was time almost to pack up, when by accident he'd gone into an HMV store to get some discs cut from the tapes he had from the Decca audition. Through them, it was pure lucky coincidence. The music publishers put him on to George Martin, who ran the Parlophone label. The Parlophone label wasn't a pop label. It had been one for comedy records, things like Beyond the Fringe, recording Peter Sellers. What decided George Martin on taking the Beatles wasn't what they played. I think it was the sense of humour, because he invited them into the control room to listen to the playbacks, and he said, now, if there's anything you don't like, let me know. And George Harrison say, well, I don't like your tie for a start. And I think that was the moment that George Martin decided he'd try and sign them up.
The Beatles set about recording their debut disc, Love Me Do, but not before ruthlessly replacing their drummer Pete Best with Ringo Starr. They left it to Brian Epstein to be the hatchet man.
The hardest thing he ever did, I think, initially, was when the other members of the Beatles instructed him to sack Pete Best, and he had a terribly sleepless night over it and he couldn't do it. Brian didn't like anything in which he'd lose face, and if there was a difficult decision to be made, he'd run away from it and try and get somebody else to make that decision for him.
3 days later, there were riots at the Cavern when the reformed Beatles appeared there, with fans chanting, Pete forever, Ringo never. George Harrison received a black eye.
Ringo had his part to play in the group. It was his sense of humour and his personality was very good, because remember, drummers, apart from the sort of the Dave Clark 5 type image, drummers were basically the people at the back of the group. And in the lineup of 3 guitars and drums, you got the 3 guitarists like in the glamorous positions up front playing the guitars and singing, and the drummers taking the back seat, which is the way it is. But you know, his sense of humour and his engaging personality certainly came across. So by all means, he was a major part of the Beatles. Well, not the Beatles, without Ringo in the city.
But the Beatles were outgrowing the Cavern. As Love Me Do climbed the British charts, peaking at number 17, the Beatles were performing further afield with a punishing schedule of one-night stands and concerts all over England. The bright lights of London beckoned ever more brightly, and the increased demands on their time finally meant living there. When the Beatles' next release, Please Please Me, got to #1, it made them the newly crowned kings of pop.
There is actually a specific date towards the end of 1963 that one can take as the birth date of Beatlemania. And it concerns a Sunday when the Beatles were topping the bill on the London Palladium. Hundreds of fans blocked Argyle Street that day, and it was those pictures that the Fleet Street photographers got that ran the following morning and marked. I think that was the first time that the media had actually used that word, Beatlemania.
There had been massive successes in popular music before the Beatles, Frank Sinatra or Elvis Presley, but none of them had raised the whole game of popular culture in the way that the Beatles did.
Playing guitars, that was probably the key element, having guitars, and then of course the yeah, yeah, yeahs, which everybody picked up on. It was new, it was fab, and it was just the start of the 60s, and you know, I was only a kid at the time, but I had to be in on it.
Nobody had imagined that popular music could include so much, could be so much, could mean so much to so many people in that particular way.
What's it like with these fans outside, Paul? At first, it's murder, because, you know, it looks as though they're going to tear you apart. Once you get the hang of it, you get used to it, and it gets to be easier.
Whenever we're doing a show, the police always come and say, don't look out the window, you know, because you excite them.
Oh, they're fab. I mean, it's their haircuts and the clothes they sit in the fashion. The way they sing, their clothes, their hair, and Ringo Starr.
For many young people, the Beatles were to become their voice in an adult world.
John, in this royal variety show, when you're appearing before royalty, your language has got to be pretty good, obviously. This thing about Ted, he's saying that he couldn't distinguish. I
can't understand
the Queen's English.
I can't understand Teddy saying that at all, really. I'm not going to vote for Ted.
It was the voice of people who, in the best sense of the term, did not know their place. The best example, I guess, would be that great occasion at the Royal Variety performance when, just before the Beatles played Twist and Shout, Lennon said, "We'd like those of you in the cheap seats to clap your hands to this one, the rest of you just rattle your jewellery," which was, you know, the kind of cheekiness towards the establishment in general and the royal family in particular, which had barely been expressed before. While much was made of the Beatles' working classness, they were actually lower middle class, and I think you could really only say that Ringo Starr was genuinely working class.
Has Ringo suggested you should stop work as a Liverpool Corporation painter?
He certainly has, but I don't want to move. I like my job, and I like the people I work with. They've been really wonderful to me.
Has Ringo's affluence made any difference to you at all?
No, not the way. I'm happy for him, like, that what he's doing, like, he's got security for the rest of his life, and we're quite happy about it.
Mrs. Bravestocky, does Ringo want to move house?
I don't really think so. He's asked us to have another house, but we're quite happy. The neighbours and everybody's very good and proud that the boys have got to where they are.
Will the neighbours not become envious of all the wealth that's been accumulated by the Beatles?
No, not the neighbours around here. They're all very good and all quite proud.
Beatlemania proved contagious. It spread throughout Europe as one hit followed another. From Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, the Lennon-McCartney compositions were irresistible. But could the Beatles conquer the biggest market of all? Ed Sullivan, America's most popular television show host at the time, took a gamble.
Throughout their entire early career, it was lucky breaks. I mean, when they returned from Sweden, and the airport was full with thousands of screaming fans. It just so happened that Ed Sullivan and his wife were passing through Heathrow Airport, and Ed Sullivan said, "What's all this happening? Is the Queen coming?" And he said, "No, it's the Beatles." He said, "What are Beatles?" And he was told, and it was Ed Sullivan who got on the phone to Brian Epstein and booked them for the Ed Sullivan Show.
Not everyone in America shared Sullivan's enthusiasm for the Beatles.
I must tell you, by the way, that Detroit University have got to stamp out the Beatle movement.
I know. Yeah, we heard about that. Detroit.
They think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't Americans.
They conquered America. Their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964 drew the biggest audience for any entertainment show in the history of television. While the Beatles performed, the national crime rate fell.
The Beatles arrived in America at almost exactly the right time. The Kennedy assassination had occurred only 3 months earlier, and its reverberations in the American psyche were still absolutely massive. They arrived in time to become part, for young America at least, of the healing process following this great national trauma. They were young, white, English-speaking, exuberant, joyful, and they were something that America could take to its collective heart.
They looked like aliens in America. They were very skinny. Nobody had those haircuts. When they first had the impact in America, it was all to do with hair, and that's why you had Beatle wigs. Beatle wigs were given away as promo items at the time, and that was the hook. They had a fantastic hook.
In the United States, of course, they created a sensation, and the press asked me what I thought about them, and I told them that I thought that eventually they probably would get a haircut, because these things have a way of passing. Like Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley and different ones who attracted teenagers by the thousands in years past. And the Beatles, I thought, were quite refreshing in a sense.
There are other factors which have to do with the sheer emotional content of the Beatles records themselves. Although the early Beatles records are not very verbally sophisticated, all those me, yous, I's, there's a lot of very simple pronouns going on in the titles and in the lyrics. They're very emotionally direct, and that's very important, particularly in Britain and America, which are Puritan societies, which are not necessarily to do with the free and frank expression of emotions. That emotional directness and excitement was and remains very powerful.
They returned home to a hero's welcome. Advance orders in America for their next single, Can't Buy Me Love, topped 2 million copies. A record.
What did you most like about the trip, Ringo?
Oh, I just loved all of it, you know, especially Miami. The sun, you know. I didn't know what it meant till I went over there.
Don't you get it up in Liverpool?
No, they finished up there, you know.
I hear anyway that the 4 of you are going to be millionaires by the end of the year.
Oh, that's nice.
Have you got time? Have you got time to actually spend this money?
What money? He said.
Doesn't he give any to you?
No. You seen that car of his?
Honours were showered upon them. In March 1964, they became show business personalities of the year.
It's very nice indeed to get, especially to get one each, because we usually have a bit of trouble cutting them in 4. I'd just like to say thank you very much. It's a great honour. Same goes for me. Thank you very much for giving us this Silver Heart. But I still think you should have given one to good old Mr. Wilson.
Ringo. Anyone who knows us knows I'm the one that never speaks, so I'd just like to say thanks a lot.
I'd just like to say the same as the others. Thanks for the Purple Hearts. Silver! Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, Al. We'd like to sincerely thank you all, and we've got to go now because the fella on the film wants us, and he says it's costing him a fortune.
That film was A Hard Day's Night. It contained 13 original Lennon-McCartney songs and was nominated for an Oscar. A civic reception in their hometown Liverpool followed. The Beatles were at the peak of their popularity, adored at home and abroad. Everybody loved the Beatles. Following another successful US visit in 1965, the Beatles received MBEs, member of the British Empire medals from Her Majesty the Queen of Buckingham Palace.
Well, gentlemen, first of all, many congratulations on your MBE. The whole country seems very delighted indeed. But how do you feel about it, Paul?
Delighted indeed. You know, I'm glad everyone's delighted. I love it.
But I mean, is it fun for you? Or?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, it'd be fun for you, wouldn't it? You know, if you
yeah,
just woke up one morning and he said, you know, it's great.
Ringo, how did you first hear about it?
Well, we heard about it 6 weeks ago when we got the forms to fill in, and then we knew that we were going to get it 2 days ago.
How did these forms come? What, straight through the post?
No. They were sent from the Prime Minister at Downing Street to our manager's office, and they were delivered from there to Twickenham, where we were filming. And then about the day later, we just found them, and we thought we were being called up to the army. And then we opened them, and we found out we weren't. We weren't.
said that line.
I know, but this is at ITV. The other, that was the other one.
It's nice to have, and it doesn't make you more respectable or anything, I don't think. Maybe other people think it does. Doesn't make me any more respectable. I'm still a scruff.
Far from being a scruff, Paul had resided in one of London's most fashionable areas for 3 years with one of the prettiest girls in town. Actress Jane Asher lived with her parents at number 57 Wimpole Street. And Paul had been invited to stay there by Jane's mother in 1963. Jane became the inspiration for many of his love songs, including And I Love Her, and it was fully expected that they would one day marry. But Beatle women were always kept firmly in the background. John Lennon had married his pregnant girlfriend Cynthia in Liverpool in August 1962, but it was a hush-hush affair. Manager Brian Epstein felt public knowledge of Lennon's marriage status could jeopardize the Beatles' popularity.
Did your wife enjoy it over there?
Yeah, she loved it. Who? Shh, don't tell him he's married. It's a secret.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry about that.
What do you think about this rumour of George being married?
He's not married because he came in to see me and he told me. Believe me, he's not married. None of us are.
However, it was Ringo who broke ranks in February 1965 and married his girlfriend Maureen.
Presumably met Ringo before the group were very successful, did you?
Yes.
Did you expect he was going to become a public monument like this?
Well, in Liverpool I did.
Yeah.
I didn't think sort of more or less all over the world, you know.
Does that worry you, that the fact that, you know, you can't go anywhere with him?
No, not really. I just sort of enjoy myself.
Do you intend to keep out the limelight like Mrs. Lennon, for example, John Lennon's wife?
Well, I don't like reporters and things.
She's on our side.
At George Harrison's side was actress and model Pattie Boyd. They married in early 1966. She became the inspiration for George's composition, Something, later described by Frank Sinatra as the greatest love song of the 20th century. In 1966, the hits continued to pour from the Lennon-McCartney pens. Yesterday was to become the most recorded song in history with 2,000 different versions. These successes gave no hint of the troubled waters that lay ahead.
The first problem we encountered in Japan was that there was this right-wing faction of students who considered that the venue the Beatles were going to play at, which was the Budokan, was sacred for only the most important Japanese sporting tournaments. And the lives of the Beatles were actually threatened. There were assassination threats. When we got to Manila, the situation was entirely different, but in its own way more frightening. What happened there was that Imelda Marcos, the First Lady, gathered together a number of the aristocracy, children, and these kids were waiting for the Beatles to be brought to them. And they were going to have an audience with the Beatles, as far as they were concerned. Now, somebody might have told the Beatles this, but unfortunately they didn't. Following morning then, the headlines in the newspapers are all about Beatles snub, Marcus, etc. And from then on, things went from bad to worse. The security was withdrawn completely. When we got to the airport to leave, there were really ugly scenes.
Did they come up and start physically threatening you? Yeah, go on, you say.
We got to the airport, and our road manager had a lot of trouble trying to get the equipment in because the escalator had been turned off and things. So we got there and we got put into the transit lounge. And then we got pushed around from one corner of the lounge to another, you know.
You treat like ordinary passenger. Ordinary passenger, There's an ordinary passenger, he doesn't get kicked, does he?
And so they started knocking over our road managers and things, and everyone was falling all over the place.
That started worrying you when the road manager got knocked over.
Yeah, and I swear there was 30 of them.
What do you say there were?
Well, I saw 5 in sort of outfit, you know, that were sort of doing the actual kicking and
and booing and shouting.
Did you get kicked in?
No, I was very delicate and moved every time they touched me.
We made a run for the aircraft, quite literally scared, not just that we would be kicked and punched, which was happening all the time, but that a sniper would actually sort of pick off one or more of the Beatles.
Would you go to Manila again, George?
Oh, no, I didn't even want to go that time.
Me too.
No, because we'd heard that it was a terrible place anyway, and when we got there, it was proved.
British fans voiced their discontent at losing their idols to another American tour. What they didn't know was that they would never see the Fab Four perform in public again. When the Beatles landed in America's Deep South in 1966, their reception was uncharacteristically cool.
Well, hi, everybody. This is Tommy Charles on the air here at WAQY Radio in Birmingham, Alabama. We've got music for you on a beautiful Thursday afternoon.
This is where the trouble all began, here in the tiny top-floor studio of station WAQY, wacky radio to the 750,000 citizens of Birmingham, Alabama.
The Beatles, for a long time, have been able to say whatever they wanted to without any regard for judgment or maturity or the wisdom of it. And no one yet has challenged them to any tremendous degree where it might count.
The big problem this time in the States at the beginning of this final tour was the remark that John Lennon had made in all innocence in quite a serious interview that he gave to Maureen Cleave for the London Evening Standard, in which he said, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus now.
Charging that Lennon's remarks were absurd and sacrilegious, Charles banned Beatles records from his programs and decided to build a mammoth bonfire to consume the group's records and souvenirs.
What he meant was that the churches weren't packed to capacity in the same way as the stadiums were for the Beatles concerts. Perfectly credible remark, valid remark to make at the time. But when this was taken out of context and changed just slightly from more popular to bigger than, indicating better than Jesus, and when this was plastered over the front page of one particular teen magazine in America, of course, quite naturally, it raised a tremendous amount of resentment.
Tommy, you're quoted as saying that though you're 36, you think like a teenager. Did you find your teenage listeners backed you up on your stand?
They did. For 3 hours, our 3 phone lines lit up, and they responded, and they said, get rid of the Beatles, ban the records, let's burn them or do something with them. And we acted, of course, on our own convictions, but we were backed up by the people, especially the younger people of this area.
Well, I think the Beatles are a real talented group, but I think that they need to watch what they say because they're in such a position that a lot of teenagers really think of them as something really big, and when they say things like that, some teenagers are going to just believe anything they say.
But are you burning your Beatles records?
Yes, sir, I burn them.
You burned them all yourself?
I've already burned them.
I don't know, I guess it sort of hurt. You know, it sort of hurt people's feelings. Because, you know, everybody thinks so much of them, and because, you know, they were sort of, you know, speaking for the teenager, you know, everybody thought they were so good and all that. And then they come up with something like this, and it just sounds like they're making fun of everything that we like.
Our church took a firm stand. Sunday in the morning worship service, the chairman of the deacons made a statement which the deacons in our church had agreed upon, backing the statement that Wacky had said that to ban the Beatles. They thought that this was good, and they firmly believe in everything that can be done to just about ruin the Beatles.
You want to ruin the Beatles?
Well, it really doesn't matter. I think it might be funny, but I guess that's sort of ugly of me.
What difference has all this row made to this tour, do you think? Any at all? Paul?
I don't think it's made much difference. It's made it more hectic. It's made all the press conferences mean a bit more. People said to us, you know, last time we came, all our answers were a bit flippant. And they said, why isn't it this time? And the thing is, the questions are a bit more serious this time.
It doesn't matter about people not liking our records or not liking the way they look or what we say. You know, they're entitled to not like us, and we're entitled not to have anything to do with them if we don't want to, or not to regard them. You know, we've all got our rights, you know.
It seems to me you've always been successful because you've been outspoken and direct and forthright and all this sort of thing. Does it seem a bit hard to you that people are now knocking you for this very thing?
Yes, Richard. It seems very hard. It seems hard. You know, free speech.
as the 60s went on and they realized that they had economic power, youth in general, as epitomized by the Beatles, also began to think that it had political power. And this brought the Beatles and youth itself into direct conflict with the state, with governments. You get the start of a right-wing backlash against the apparent freedoms of the 60s, and that's actually where it starts, in 1966, which is a key year. You also have John Lennon in the same tour, in the press conferences from the same tour, making very explicit statements about the Vietnam War.
Do you mind being asked questions? For example, in America, people keep asking you questions about Vietnam. Does this seem useful?
Well, I don't know. You know, if you can say that war's no good and a few people believe you, then it may be good. I don't know. You can't say too much, though. That's the trouble.
It seems a bit silly to be in America and for none of them to mention Vietnam as if nothing was happening.
But why should they ask you about it? You're successful entertainer.
That is why they... You know.
Because Americans always ask showbiz people what they think about it. So do the British, you know. Showbiz, you know how it is. But I mean, you've just got to, you can't just keep quiet about anything that's going on in the world unless you're a monk. Sorry, monks, I didn't mean it. I meant actually.
For the most part, however, the Fab Four's appearances in America continue to stir emotions of a more familiar kind.
So please, lad, what did they lie about, honey?
I thought they'd come down there where you could see them.
And you came all the way out here? Now, do you have a ticket for the show tonight?
Yes.
Well, are you going to the afternoon or evening performance?
The evening.
And who do you say lied to you?
The police did.
What did they tell you, honey?
They told us they'd come down there.
And they wouldn't let you come down here? Is that anything to cry over?
When you wait 2.5 years, it is.
Now, you officers that are stationed in front of the stage, you will go to Mr. Morris Shapiro, the first aid man, and he will furnish you with earplugs so as to keep you from having a headache. If he runs out of earplugs, he has got some cotton.
A number of things played a part in ending the touring days. First of all, there was the whole security angle. They were living, they felt as captives, shut up most of the time in hotel suites, under house arrest, if you like. Their music was certainly not being appreciated on stage because most of the time with 1960s style sound systems, they couldn't be heard above the screaming.
For years they couldn't hear what they were playing, they couldn't hear what they were singing. Don't forget, this is the days before really good PA systems and great monitoring systems on stage. And one particular night they came off, and Paul just said to Ringo, "What were you doing in whatever song it was, you know?" And Ringo said, "Well, we didn't do that song tonight." And Paul and John looked at each other and said, "Well, we did it." So Ringo had been playing a totally different song to the rest of the three Beatles, and they didn't know.
All these things combined so that at the end of that summer, the very last show took place in San Francisco, Candlestick Park. There was nothing remarkable about the occasion at all until we got back onto the aircraft, the charter plane, to fly back down the Californian coast to Los Angeles. George Harrison sank into one of the seats near me and said, "Well, that's it then, I'm not a Beatle anymore."
No, not again. I couldn't take no more.
The one that changed most of the four, I guess, was George. George Harrison started out by being the most easygoing and patient and tolerant of people. And I think the stresses and strains and pressures of Beatlemania at its peak got to George eventually and had the strongest reaction on him because he had been trying to preserve his cool, if you like, and suddenly he burst.
Do you think that in the new year that you're going to be going your own ways instead of being a group?
No.
No? What about another word? The songwriting team thing will keep going on whatever happens, will it?
Yeah, we'll probably carry on writing music forever, you know, whatever else we're doing. Because you just can't stop. You find yourself doing it whether you want to or not.
But do you think the tours, like the American tours and the English one, you know, the stands in England?
You know, there must be a point where they don't work anymore because they're not to do with what we're doing, record-wise or film-wise.
See, it's gone downhill, performance, because we can't develop when no one can hear us, you know what I mean? So for us to perform is, it's difficult, gets difficult each time.
You mean they don't listen to you, and therefore you don't want to do that?
Oh yeah, we want to do it, but if we're not listened to, then, and we can't even hear ourselves, then we can't improve in that. We can't get any better. So we're trying to get better with things like recording.
So essentially, their entire creative process shifted to the studio. They were also incredibly fortunate in this respect because the producer they ended up working with was George Martin. His classical music background and his ability to do very unusual things with studio technology, I think all those things added up to make him the perfect person to produce the Beatles, and certainly the most important creative collaborator that the group ever had.
They'd hum something, they'd hum a melody to George Martin, and then he'd translate it into a string quartet or whatever, or a whole brass band or a whole string section. He also edited the Beatles, which makes the records of that period, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and the singles all around that period. They're all very compressed. There's a lot of ideas going on in a very short time. That makes you want to listen to them again and again and again.
The Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership had dominated the Beatles, but with their performances now confined to the studios, a new creative force emerged within the band.
It was George Harrison who introduced the sitar into sort of Western pop music. The influence of Ravi Shankar onto him and his interest in Indian music did help into develop the Beatles' music. And suddenly George started to have this sort of impact and input that he could have had before.
And of course he was the guy that then led them on after that, eventually into the transcendental meditation. And I can see why for a short period of time the Beatles went along with this and welcomed this. If transcendental meditation represented tranquility and peace, that most of all in their heads is what the Beatles were after 3 years of Beatlemania and touring the world.
By 1967, the Beatles were in a very peculiar position. They were, in essence, gods. They were very young men who'd become very successful. They had more money than they knew what to do with. They had incredible cultural power. If they lifted a finger, it got a front page. This is an extraordinary position to find yourself in, and I think you start looking for answers, you start looking for something more.
But before they could find those answers, tragedy struck. The Beatles were in Wales, attending a course on transcendental meditation with their Indian guru, the Maharishi, when they learned that Brian Epstein had been found dead in London.
You heard the news this afternoon, I believe.
Yes.
And Paul's already gone down?
Yes.
I see. You've no idea what your plans are for tomorrow?
No, we'd just go and find out, you know. Just have to play everything by ear.
Yes. I understand that Mr. Epstein was to be initiated here tomorrow.
Yes.
Brian had lived alone in a house in the heart of London's Belgravia district. While the Beatles meditated in Wales, Brian lay dying behind locked doors. Depressed and on drugs, it seemed he had died of an accidental overdose. He was 32 years old.
I understand that this afternoon Maharishi conferred with you all. Could I ask you what advice he offered you?
He told us not to get overwhelmed by grief and to whatever thoughts we have of Brian, to keep them happy, because any thoughts we have of him will travel to him wherever he is.
In his personal life, he was a fairly sad person, actually. He was gay in an era where it was not only unfashionable to be gay, but also illegal. But he wasn't even a happy homosexual, to the extent that he never had one good, steady, loving relationship. He had no one loving partner at all. At this stage, of course, before Epstein's death, the Beatles had already decided to set up their own Apple Corps companies. And there was never on their part any intention to involve Brian Epstein with those companies. Brian knew that. He knew that just as thoroughly as he knew that they were never going to tour again. So there was great disappointment on his part.
All four Beatles attended his memorial service at the New London Synagogue, close to the Abbey Road studios.
Well, Brian was rarely the man who brought them to international prominence, but some of the things he did proved disastrous, and the Beatles ended up, at the end of a decade of being the world's top group, with not much money. The recording deal he did with EMI, I think they got a halfpenny a record, and that lasted for a lot of years, so they were getting really a pittance for selling these millions of records, while the Rolling Stones with Decca had a much more favourable deal and were getting far larger royalties.
When it came into the big league merchandising that surrounded the Beatles during the height of the Beatlemania years, yes, it is true that opportunities were not seized in the way that they should have done.
The Beatles lost $100 million worth of merchandising in America right at the peak time.
With Brian gone, the Beatles launched their new business empire, Apple Corps. Number 3 Savile Row became its eventual headquarters. With film, fashion and recording divisions, they described it as a capitalist communist enterprise.
What they'd originally wanted was to create an atmosphere for creative people and develop other talents away from what they call the men in suits, who'd taken all the money in taxes and all these accountants and lawyers and all the rest of that. They didn't really like them. But they had a great vision of what they wanted to do. And here again, once again, the Beatles were trying to do something which may have worked.
Early in 1968, the Beatles flew to Rishikesh in India to resume their studies in transcendental meditation with their Maharishi.
Really, the biggest influence, I think, on the Beatles creatively was transcendental meditation. John and Paul did the biggest output of their songs when they were at the Maharishi's ashram in Rishikesh. I think they wrote over 30 or 40 songs over there in a very short time.
But the love affair didn't last. Disillusionment set in as the Beatles concluded the Maharishi was exploiting them. Ringo and Paul soon returned to England. George and John followed later.
Does this mean that you've finished with him now? He's
well, it's not finished with, you know, but we're over that phase. It was a bit of a phase. But he's still a nice fella and everybody's fine. But we don't go out with him anymore.
Once I had a dream that made me sad.
While the Beatles flirted with Eastern mysticism, their Apple Corps had gone rotten. The first casualty was the Apple Boutique, which collapsed after 8 months.
Everybody wants all they can grab.
The remaining stock was given away.
The business side was placed in the hands of other people. And this is why it failed, because the Beatles didn't actually run Apple. They just put the money in, and while they poured the money in, it was dripping out the other side.
The Beatles' increasingly outlandish behavior had not gone unnoticed. For many, they were no longer the Fab Four.
In this view of the Beatles as turning from cuddly toys into something more threatening and odd, drugs are obviously very important. A big symbol of this is in 1966, when the Beatles stopped touring and cut their mop tops and grow moustaches and beards, and John Lennon has the granny glasses, and they start to look weird.
I knew the whole history of any involvement they had with drugs because I was at Gambier Terrace flat the night they had their first introduction to what was sort of literally a drug. That was when Royston Ellis, the poet, broke open a Vic inhaler and showed them the benzodrine inside and said, if you chew that like a spitball, then that makes you high. And that was the first introduction to sort of getting high on any type of drug. I mean, to them, the basic drug was having a few beers. It was Bob Dylan who actually introduced them to marijuana because they were so naive about any drugs or the effect of drugs. And he came to their hotel room with a big pile of marijuana. And they told him, well, we've never smoked this before. And he was completely surprised. He said, but you've had it in your songs. You've got that song where it's got I Get High. And of course, it wasn't wrong. He'd misinterpreted the song. It wasn't I Get High at all, you know?
Yes, they did take a variety of drugs. And were quite outspoken about it. They would have been more outspoken about it if Brian Epstein hadn't prevented them from being.
How often have you taken LSD?
About 4 times.
And where did you get it from?
Oh, you know, I mean, if I was to say where I got it from, you know, it's illegal and everything. It's silly to say that.
Don't you believe that this was a matter which you should have kept private?
But the thing is, you know, that I was asked a question by a newspaper. And the decision was whether to tell a lie or to tell him the truth, you know. I decided to tell him the truth. But
I really didn't want to say anything, you know, because if I'd had my decision, you know, if I had it my way, I wouldn't have told anyone, you know, because I'm not trying to spread the word about this. But the man from the newspaper is the man from the mass medium, you know. I'll keep it a personal thing. If he does too, you know, if he keeps it quiet. But he wanted to spread it, so it's his responsibility, you know, for spreading it, not mine.
But you're a public figure, and you said it in the first place, and you must have known that it would have made the newspapers.
Yes, but to say it, you know, is only to tell the truth. I'm telling the truth, you know. I don't know what everyone's so angry about.
Well, do you think you have now encouraged your fans to take drugs?
I don't think it'll make any difference, you know. I don't think my fans are going to take drugs just because I did, you know. But the thing is, that's not the point anyway, you know. I was asked whether I had or not. And then from then on, the whole bit about how far it's going to go and how many people it's going to encourage is up to the newspapers and up to you, you know, on television. I mean, you're spreading this now at this moment. This is going into all the homes, you know, in Britain. And I'd rather it didn't, you know. But you're asking me the question. You want me to be honest. I'll be honest, you know.
But as a public figure, surely you've got a responsibility to lots and
No,
lots
it's
of
you've
teenagers.
got the responsibility. You've got the responsibility not to spread this now. You know, I'm quite prepared to keep it as a very personal thing, if you will too. If you'll shut up about it, I will.
The Beatles, who were immune for a long time, the Rolling Stones got arrested in early 1967 for drugs. The Beatles, who used as much drugs as the Rolling Stones, or maybe a bit less, I don't think anybody could use as much drugs as the Rolling Stones. John Lennon was arrested for drugs in the autumn of 1968, and so was George Harrison around the same time. They were no longer immune. The fact that they had MBEs didn't make them immune any longer.
In November 1966, in this quiet backwater of London, John Lennon attended an avant-garde art exhibition held at this building by a Japanese artist from New York. That chance encounter was to change the Beatles' destiny forever.
The arrival of Yoko Ono on Planet Beatles was probably the single catalytic event that precipitated both the end of the British public's love affair with the Beatles and the end of John Lennon's working relationship with the rest of the group.
The big thing that did occur was that Lennon took Yoko Ono into recording sessions with the Beatles. So previously it had just been the four of them and no girlfriends had come in or wives had come in for any, it was a boys' club. In bringing Yoko Ono into the studio, John Lennon made it clear that it wasn't a boys' club anymore. The boys were becoming men.
Under the influence of Yoko Ono, Lennon was announcing that he wished to be considered as an artist rather than as an entertainer.
I think Yoko Ono suppressed John's creativity and imposed her own ideas on him.
Can you describe your new act together? What is howling?
An expression that's not so intellectualized as words, you know. It's just like...
pure sound.
Show me
pure
what
sound. Well, anything. Wow, that's howling.
You know, something like that.
Quite frankly, people weren't really interested in that, but John he felt because people didn't like Yoko's input, that they were insulting her, and through insulting her, they were insulting him. So he dug his heels in even more. And yet his creativity was being suppressed.
Another powerful lady had landed on Planet Beatle. Linda Eastman, a rock photographer from New York, married Paul McCartney in the spring of 1969 and broke 1 million female hearts.
When did you decide to get married, Paul?
About a week ago.
What prompted it?
Just, you know, so we decided to do it instead of thinking about it.
Linda, how do you feel about it all? You're obviously terribly happy. How are you feeling this morning?
Terribly happy.
Well, that's good enough.
Unquote.
Linda, you'll be described as a New York socialite. Does this mean you'll be spending much of your time in New York?
Yeah.
Where will you be living?
In London.
In London. Paul, what about you? How do you feel to be the father to a 6-year-old? You'll be living in London. How about being the father to a 6-year-old child?
It's terrible. It's terrible. I hate it. I hate it. And it's going to be a terrible burden. I do. It's horrible. Yeah. You're on the telly. You're on the telly. Come on.
As if in reaction, John and Yoko married 8 days later and honeymooned in Amsterdam. They made it a public affair. Their bed-in was a demonstration for world peace.
We were thinking that instead of going out and fight and make war or something like that, we should just stay in bed. Everybody should just stay in bed and enjoy the spring, you know.
Opinion has remained divided on why the Beatles broke up.
The blame for the breaking up of the Beatles is very often laid at the feet of Yoko Ono and Linda Eastman. But in fact, I don't really think that their arrival on the scene caused any disbanding at all. From the end of 1966 onwards, it's evident on the recordings that they made that increasingly John was going his way, Paul was going his way. They still went into the recording studios calling themselves the Beatles, but by and large, instead of 4 guys arriving for a session, it would be John taking his material in and bringing Paul and the others into it, and Paul keeping his stuff to himself and bringing the others into it.
If there's clouds in the sky, you can dry your...
The Beatles performed in public for the last time in January 1969. In an impromptu concert on the rooftop of their Apple headquarters in Mayfair, they played for 42 minutes before the police intervened. Their music had stopped the traffic. But that brief harmony was short-lived. New Yorker Alan Klein, Apple's controversial new business manager, was appointed contrary to McCartney's wishes, causing further division within the band. Against all odds, in July 1969, the Beatles came together one last time to record their 12th album. Its cover featured the Beatles on this pedestrian crossing. Abbey Road became one of their most creative and best-selling albums of all time. In April 1970, McCartney made his departure from the Beatles official.
He says himself for personal differences and business differences and for musical differences, for those reasons. But I would think that it's because he wants to find out who he is himself and whether he can do what he wants to do himself.
The Beatles were no more. But their legacy would endure. That long and winding road that had started here in Liverpool a dozen years before had reached to every corner of the world.
It was the Beatles' influence, not only in music, but sort of worldwide, from the sense of humor to the happy films they made, that enchanted millions of people. They inspired so many other people. You'd find it with artists, with fashion designers, with record producers, with writers. So many people in every aspect of life were influenced by the Beatles and said, I did that because of the Beatles.
As far as I'm concerned, they've contributed everything to pop music. I mean, they were the group that made me get into music in the first place.
I always felt that they were pop music, and they're kind of what everybody else is judged on.
And George is going to do one for you now. It's an old favorite, folks. It's one I took there, and it's called Roll Over Beethoven.
Almost 30 years after the Beatles' last concert, the bootleg Beatles pack auditoriums around the world with audiences still in love with the Beatles and their music.
I think a lot of young kids that come and see us now just want to see what it was like.
And that's what we try and do. We try and capture the atmosphere, as well as the sound and the look, the atmosphere of the Beatles live.
Every group, whether they are directly influenced by the Beatles or not, is in a sense there because of the Beatles.
They basically defined what pop music is.
When told by the record companies or music publishers or television producers, that isn't the way we do it, we've never done it that way, they would simply say, well, why can't we? We'll do it that way, and they did.
They showed you could be very successful with material that is very, very good, that you could play up to the market rather than play down.
So much of the landscape and fabric of popular culture today is there because the Beatles put it there. The Beatles built the house that we live in.
A continuación, especial de Charles M. Schulz. Y al terminar, el noticiario cultural 9:30.